Hello and welcome. I'm Jennifer Winter. I'm a professor at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, and I'm very pleased to host this webinar today. I'm joined by Anna Canduth from the Canadian Climate Institute and William Scott from Simon Fraser University. And today we're going to be talking about the Canadian Climate Policy Inventory and how it can help you understand the complexities of Canadian climate policy. To start, I want to acknowledge the traditional territories that we are gathered on. The University of Calgary, located in the heart of southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. The University of Calgary is situated on land northwest of where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, a site traditionally known as Mohkinstsis to the Blackfoot, Wichaspa to the Stoney Nakoda, and Gustista to the Tsuut'ina. On this land and in this place, we strive to learn together, walk together, and grow together in a good way. I'm now going to give a brief introduction to the Canadian Climate Policy Partnership, which is the driving force behind the Canadian Climate Policy Inventory. Our goal is data-driven research on an analysis of Canadian climate policies and enabling the same in a network of researchers. And to do that, we needed to create a database of Canadian climate policies. And through this, we're providing publicly accessible information on federal, provincial, and territorial climate policies. We facilitate improved understanding of the state of climate policy in Canada. And through this, we support effective strategies in governments and in civil society to adapt to and mitigate climate change. And we're also improving research and policy capacity to meet Canada's climate goals federally, provincially, and territorially. We have a large research team spread across many universities. The current research team is listed here, and we have coast-to-coast academics engaged in developing the database. My colleague William Scott will run through the database in just a moment. And I also want to acknowledge the funders and partners behind the Canadian Climate Policy Inventory and C2P2. This includes the Canadian Climate Institute, MyTax, the School of Public Policy, the University of Calgary, Serrano, Quebec Net Positif, Smart Prosperity Institute, Government of British Columbia, Royal Roads University, and the Government of Canada. And now I'll turn it over to, oh, no, I will not turn it over yet. I will just very briefly talk about initial outputs, and then I will turn it over to Anna. The project has resulted in a downloadable comprehensive database of 327 federal, provincial, and territorial climate change mitigation policies in Canada. And this is an evergreen database, and we are updating it on an ongoing basis. We have a searchable and interactive web-based database hosted by 440 Megatonnes, which is a project of the Canadian Climate Institute. And we have a methods document explaining how we developed the database and a decision process for which policies were included. And I will now turn it over to Anna to discuss the background and history behind this project.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today talking about this exciting initiative. So as Jen mentioned, my name is Anna Canduth. I'm the director of the 440 Megatonnes initiative at the Canadian Climate Institute, and I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And maybe for those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute, we're a national climate policy think tank conducting research and analysis across 3 streams: mitigation, adaptation, and clean growth. And as Jen mentioned, we're also proud partners of C2P2. And 2 years ago at the Institute, we launched 440 Megatonnes, which is a new data-driven website with 2 main goals. The first is to track progress towards Canada's emissions reduction targets. And the second was to establish a one-stop shop for data and analysis on Canada's climate policy progress. And ultimately, our objective with 440 is to improve the effectiveness of climate policy in Canada by adding clarity and evidence to conversations about policy and progress, and also by supporting a cycle of continuous policy improvement. So building on the momentum that we've seen over the last few years. And just on that same slide, Will, thanks. So just finally, in terms of who we are, while the core 440 team is comprised of Institute staff, we're really a collaborative project. So many of our resources are developed in partnership with leading researchers and organizations across Canada. So that includes Navius Research, the Canadian Energy and Emissions Data Centre, Seton Stiebert, and of course, the Canadian Climate Policy Partnership. And then finally, in terms of what we do, our website features interactive databases, dashboards, downloadable data, and then insights that track key indicators of progress. Next slide, please. And one of our flagship and most popular databases has been the Canadian Climate Policy Inventory, which was formerly known as the Policy Tracker. So when we launched 440 Megatonnes back in November of 2022, we knew we were going to partner with Jen and C2P2 to publish the Canadian Climate Policy Inventory. But recognizing that there was an urgent data gap in Canada, we worked with Navius Research to publish a climate policy tracker really as an interim product ahead of C2P2's Canadian Climate Policy Inventory. So this initial database that we had on the 440 website included hundreds of mitigation policies at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels, and included a smaller subset of the categories that are now available through the climate policy inventory. So including things like policy type, implementation status, and coverage. And between November 2022 and this past summer, my team at the Institute regularly updated the database as new climate policies were announced, or as policies moved through the implementation process from announced to legislated. And then when the C2P2 inventory was launched last month, we replaced our policy tracker with C2P2's climate policy inventory. And as Jen mentioned, are really proud to host the searchable interactive version of the inventory on our website. So I know Will is going to get into the why of the inventory in more detail, but I'll just briefly say, why I think this work matters, and in particular, why it's a really critically important piece of what we do at 440 Megatonnes. So as I mentioned, 440 was set up to create a one-stop shop for data on policy and progress. And this inventory does just that by providing really comprehensive data on what and which types of policies have been implemented or announced to drive emissions reductions at the federal, provincial, and territorial orders of government. Second, it helps track progress. So both by tracking which policies have been introduced to reduce emissions, but also by following policies through the policy process from announced to implemented. And then finally, as Jen mentioned, it creates a really important foundation for future climate policy research by creating that baseline understanding of what kind of policies exist across jurisdictions or across sectors. And that's not all in theory, but it's also been true in practice as well. So since we launched the initial policy database back in November of 2022, the website and that database in particular has had over 3,200 unique visitors with over 900 data downloads. And in just the past month since the launch of the Canadian Climate Policy Inventory, we've had almost 900 unique visitors, which is pretty amazing. And we've seen the database being used by academics and researchers in Canada. So for instance, really recently, scholars at the University of Waterloo leveraged the database in a recent paper looking at policies to advance direct air capture. And last year, the RBC Climate Action Institute also used the database as the foundation to analyze government spending on climate in their first annual report. And then finally, I'll just say that, we often get questions in the 440 and then the Institute email inboxes asking us, what governments are doing in a given sector or to advance a given technology. And it's been really great to have a comprehensive database to point to, and I'm happy we have C2P2's enhanced version to do so now. So I'll pass it over to Will.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Jen. Good morning. My name is Will Scott. I'm an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in the School of Public Policy. I'm joining from Vancouver today on the traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And so as many of the folks here know, we've seen a proliferation of climate change mitigation policies across jurisdictions in Canada. Tracking and evaluating this complex mix of climate policies is particularly challenging in federations like Canada, where authority for regulating greenhouse gas emissions falls under both federal and provincial or territorial jurisdiction. Climate policy development in Canada has demonstrated variation in timing, effort, and approach across jurisdictions. And this might reflect differences in terms of economic structure, political ideologies, access to energy resources, and emissions profiles. We've seen that international climate policy databases and aggregated policy measures often fail to account for this subnational heterogeneity across jurisdictions. So this database seeks to address this challenge and help us understand the landscape of the current federal, provincial, and territorial climate change mitigation policies in Canada. So today's webinar, I'm going to walk through some of the steps we took through the construction of the database, present a few of the initial findings, and highlight future directions for development. Additionally, I'll walk through how you can access the database for your own exploration or use in research. So in order to construct the database, we first had to define what would be included as a climate change mitigation policy. For the purposes of this database, we define a climate change mitigation policy as one with the stated primary objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It must be funded, required, or implemented by a federal, provincial, or territorial government. We distinguish between individual policies by the instrument used, the mechanism through which the policy seeks to reduce emissions. Notably, this excludes some important types of policies. For instance, climate policies implemented by other orders of government, including Indigenous governments and municipalities. Also, policies with different primary objectives, like clean growth or climate adaptation, that aren't focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but might still be important for the energy transition. And policies that may directly or indirectly contradict greenhouse gas reduction efforts, like subsidies for fossil fuel production. Using this inclusion criteria, we began with 3 main sources to construct our initial policy list. These included the existing database, as mentioned, produced by Navius Research and the Canadian Climate Institute, as well as biennial reports submitted by Canada to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and some previous research that I've conducted with colleagues at the University of Victoria. We then continued to build out the database using a range of publicly available sources. These include things like published climate plans, budgets, policy announcements, and legislation. And constructing and reviewing the database essentially occurred in 3 main steps. First, we generated the list of all policies that met our inclusion criteria. And then we coded them according to a range of characteristics. I won't go into great detail here in terms of all of the attributes and definitions for each of these, but they include key descriptive elements like the name of the policy and a description of it, the economic sector it applies to based on National Emissions Inventory economic sectors, the type of policy instrument. And what we mean by policy type is intended to differentiate between mandatory policies. These are sometimes thought of as policy sticks. These are policies which impose a compulsory requirement on regulated parties. For example, a mandatory policy might require a certain proportion of electricity to be generated by renewable electricity, or require a reduction in the emissions intensity of the transportation fuel supply. Abatement support policies, which we can think of as policy carrots, are those that seek to incentivize the voluntary adoption, production, or development of lower emissions processes and products. For example, subsidies for the adoption of electric vehicles or heat pumps. And finally, indirect instruments are those that don't directly require or incentivize emissions reductions, but they may nevertheless contribute. For instance, these could include information measures that require the reporting of facility emissions or the labeling of energy efficiency on consumer products. And within each of these instrument types, we also distinguish between specific policy instruments. So for example, mandatory instruments include regulations, tradable performance standards, and emissions pricing. Abatement support policies include consumer subsidies, producer subsidies, infrastructure subsidies, and R&D funding. And indirect policies include information policies and enabling legislation. We also classified policies according to their scope of coverage. Broad-based policies are often preferred by economists because they allow for equal marginal abatement costs across a wider scope and improve economic efficiency. Policies that are more narrowly targeted alter the incidence of cost across sectors and technologies. However, it's also been argued that these narrower policies face less political opposition and may be justified by other co-benefits. So for example, we classify the broadest policies as those applying across multiple sectors, like Quebec's cap and trade program. And as they get more narrow, policies might target one sector, like a low carbon fuel standard for transportation. They might target one class of technologies, like passenger vehicles with zero emissions, or one specific technology, like electric cars, or even one specific project, like support for the Inuvik wind farm. We also look at the start and end dates of policies, if applicable, the abatement channel, or where in the energy system emissions are reduced, and include data on total and average annual funding where that's available and applicable. Once we had a first draft of the inventory, we went through an extensive review process, starting with an academic review. As Jen mentioned, we have a terrific team of more than 20 academics and research assistants from across the country. So we had at least 2 members of the academic team review the coding for each policy and assess the comprehensiveness of policy representation for each jurisdiction. Here we leverage the national nature of the partnership to tap into expertise across the country by having folks based in a jurisdiction or with some type of regional expertise review those jurisdictions. And as you can see in the flowchart here, any proposed changes were flagged, discussed, and then accepted or rejected on a consensus basis. We then shared the draft inventory for each jurisdiction with the respective government departments to seek feedback, corrections, and ensure the comprehensiveness of the database. We were fortunate to receive feedback from the governments of Canada, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. And once again, any proposed changes or modifications were discussed and accepted or rejected by a consensus basis. In total, we identified 327 policies across federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions in Canada. As you can see, the policy counts are not evenly distributed across jurisdictions. The federal government is responsible for the greatest number of policies across jurisdictions with 71. This is followed by British Columbia with 57, Quebec with 36, and PEI with 24. We also find that abatement support policies, or policy carrots, represented in orange, are by far the most common instrument type, representing more than 70% of all policies. Within this group, producer subsidies represent 22% of all subsidies, followed by consumer subsidies at 18%. Mandatory policies, represented in blue, including regulations, pricing, tradable performance standard, compose 22% of all policies. And we do see somewhat different variation between jurisdictions in terms of the number of mandatory policies in place, with BC having the most. And we also find that indirect policies are the least frequently used, representing just 7% of the total. When we look at the types of instruments used and the scope at which they're applied, additional trends emerge. We can see that abatement support policies, while quite common, tend to be more narrowly targeted at the project, technology, or class level. In contrast, mandatory policies with broad application are expected to do much of the heavy lifting in terms of driving emissions reduction, if they are stringent in their design. Looking at the distribution of policies across sectors, we find that nearly a quarter of all policies apply to transportation, and almost another quarter apply across multiple economic sectors. Buildings account for another 21%, electricity accounts for 16%, and oil and gas account for 6% of policies. And in the last graph here, we look at the share of policy instrument types across economic sectors. And as you can see, the policy approach differs by the sector that these policies are being applied to. Climate change mitigation policies targeting the agricultural sector are exclusively carrots. This could be perhaps in order to prevent cost increases from being passed through to food prices or exports. And in other sectors like oil and gas, as well as waste, we see a much greater share of mandatory policies. Now, these figures are just to give you an impression of some of the things we can look at within the database. But there's an important caveat. It's important to remember, particularly when we look at figures like these, that policy density, or the number of policies present, is not necessarily indicative of the effectiveness or the emissions reduction that we should expect. All policies are not created equal here. For instance, it's possible that one broad and stringent policy could achieve major emissions reductions. And it could also be the case that a jurisdiction has many policies, but if they're narrowly targeted and weak, they might not have much of an impact on emissions. Importantly, interactions between overlapping policies can also alter outcomes. They're not necessarily additive in terms of the emissions reduction, and interactions might provide synergies in some cases, but they also might lead to unintended impacts or trade-offs across important policy objectives like cost and distributional equity, which are important areas for further research that we hope to dig into with this inventory. And this leads us to some of the future directions we're looking at for continued development of the database. The database represents a starting point, and we have plans to continue to expand the database and the research it can be used for. Specifically, continuing to expand the database in terms of policy changes through time. The database will be updated regularly to reflect new policy announcements and design choices as they emerge, as well as to reflect when policies expire or are canceled. We also have ongoing research to enhance the comparability of policies and the policy mix between jurisdictions. To do so, we're working on measures of stringency and coverage to be able to make these comparisons and open up new avenues for empirical research. Not all greenhouse gas emissions within an economy are regulated, and many emissions are regulated by more than one policy. Therefore, it's necessary to track the coverage of climate policies in terms of how much and which emissions are regulated by each policy to identify gaps and situations of policy overlap. But quantifying the emissions coverage of the policy mix faces challenges in terms of data availability and accounting for the regulation of new capital. For stringency, a variety of indicators and indexes have been developed using national policies to compare policy efforts between countries, but these often fail to account for the subnational variation and interactions that we've talked about. And additional research is needed to make these comparisons more practical and comparable. Finally, we plan to continue to enhance the policy in terms of representing different design characteristics that are reflected in the database. For instance, by accounting for the ways that policies may or may not target equity-deserving groups. Importantly, we want to invite you to use, explore, and continue to build upon the database as well. You can access an interactive version online here at 440megatonnes.ca/policy tracker. It's also available in French, which you can access by clicking here, and will bring you to a French version of the website. You can use the drop-down menus here to make selections to browse the database. For example, filtering the database to look at a particular jurisdiction, by economic sector, by implementation status, by instrument type, or abatement channel. And you can also search the database by keyword. So, for example, filtering for federal transportation policies will bring up a list of policies. And you can expand any policy on the list using the green plus symbol. This will provide additional detail, including the policy description and references that you can explore further and confirm the information provided. And finally, you can download the complete database by clicking here. And this will allow you to download the database as a spreadsheet to contribute to your own research and analysis. You can explore and visualize the data in different ways, or continue to build the database out by creating additional columns based on the aspects that you're most interested in. And finally, you can reach the Canadian Climate Policy Partnership website from the 440 Megatonnes website here, and through the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. Here you'll find additional links to the database and other resources, such as the methods document, which provides extensive detail on the process and definitions. And with that, we'd like to thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Will. And everyone, please use the Q&A function to pose questions to our panelists. And if you have, I think, more extended questions or feedback on the database, please feel free to email us at c2p2@ucalgary.ca. And the links and information will also be posted in the chat. And the questions are starting to roll in. So Anna and Will, question is, how would you see the database support policymakers and decision making related to mitigation or climate change policies in Canada? And then in addition to that, how would it support transition pathways, which likely require a mix of initiatives and staging over time? And so I guess it's like a two-part question is, how does it help with decision making? And then how does it help us understand transition pathways?
Yeah, certainly. So I think this can provide a really useful resource for policymakers and decision makers in terms of better understanding both what's occurring within jurisdictions and across jurisdictions. In Canada, we have this kind of experimentation where different provinces and territories have been able to act and pilot and develop new types of policy. And here, provinces and territories can learn from each other and see what's been successful, try to adopt those policies, or to look at policy areas, coverage areas, where emissions might not be regulated in one jurisdiction, but may be regulated in others. In terms of the stages of the transition, looking at technology development pathways, we've seen that some of the pioneering efforts by some jurisdictions have helped drive down the cost of technologies, making things easier to adopt for other jurisdictions. And we may also see different types of policies that we can implement based on technology and transition basis.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add to that, the Institute's done a lot of work on net zero pathways, transition pathways, and we've seen that, Canada's transition to net zero will require what we call both safe bet solutions, so certain technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps, but is also going to require what we consider to be wildcard solutions. So more uncertain technologies that may have cost barriers or tech barriers like direct air capture or hydrogen. And so understanding what policies have been introduced by governments to drive both those safe bets and wildcards forward would be an interesting question when thinking about transition pathways in Canada.
Great. Thank you very much. Next question. I think this is more directed to Will, but are there any key sectors you've identified where there is a lack of or weak climate policies?
So I would caution interpreting policy counts and some of these preliminary findings as necessarily a measurement of the strength of that policy effort. We can see sectors where there are certainly fewer policies. A notable one here is oil and gas. It was only 6% of total policies, but it's also covered by many of the policies that cover multiple jurisdictions. It's also important to remember that the number of policies is not necessarily indicative of the strength, and that's highlights kind of the future areas for development here. We're working on ways to better compare the stringency and coverage of individual policies, as well as the entire policy mix, to be able to make those comparisons in a more fair and complete way. This is an enormous challenge. This is comparing different types of instruments based on how they perform and finding equal ways of measuring that is really a challenge, has been through research, and will be a priority going forward.
Great. Thanks, Will. Anything to add, Anna? No? All right. Perfect. Thank you. This is a great question, and I think following from the previous one, whether or not it's possible to weigh individual policy items by a scaling factor like modeled emissions reductions to try and get at that. I think that stringency or coverage question, which is, I think, the ultimate objective of many of these policies and trying to understand how the policies interact.
Yeah, so just to build on that, there are, we've seen some great modeling work. Some work has been done by the Canadian Climate Institute. The Government of Canada also reports some estimated abatement by measures in their biennial reports to the UNFCCC. And these are useful. They provide us some guide for the amount of abatement we might be able to expect from policies, but it's also hard to make these comparisons in kind of a direct way. Policies tend to interact, so it matters a lot what the baseline is, what the non-policy scenario you are comparing in terms of emissions reduction from adding an additional policy. Whether there are any policies present or no policies present can really change that number. So that's an important dimension to consider. And additionally, some modeling efforts, or when you look at results from different modeling efforts, we might get quite different results depending on what the baseline assumptions are. We tried to account for some of that and have captured some of the UNFCCC reported modeling estimates, but this is really an area for further development that we're interested in digging into.
Yeah, maybe I'll just quickly build on that to say, as Will was mentioning, the Institute's tried to do this work and it's really complex. So I guess last March, we put out a piece looking at kind of the relative impact of major climate policies in Canada in 2030, again, relative to a specific baseline, as Will was saying. And we recorded them as ranges because isolating a specific mitigation, megaton of reductions to a policy is really challenging because there are those complex interactions. So that's one way that we've tried to get around this question, is providing a range. Some policies have a wider range, some are much more certain, but it's work that I think we're all going to continue to do because it's a really important question.
Thank you very much. Next question is about how we're building out the database and including new policies with government announcements, and whether or not it'll go through the same review process as done at the beginning of the project. So I think, Will, that's for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the beautiful things about this project is that it is intended to be ongoing, evergreen, and long-lived. One of the challenges we ran into in developing this, we started wanting to look backwards as well, wanting to have a sense of kind of where we were coming from with policy development. And this proved challenging. We see there are good records for a lot of regulations, legislation. We have records for that. But for some of these more narrowly targeted programs, subsidies for certain technologies, as programs change and governments change, you sort of disappear from the internet and are harder to track in a comprehensive way. So that's why it's really important for us going forward to continue to track these policy announcements, budgets, and be able to keep a historical record so that going forward, we can see whether we're making progress. And it'll also open up new avenues for empirical research to see how changes in the policy mix, in policy stringency, have corresponded to actual emissions changes.
Thanks. Okay, the next question is, how do we think access to the database would influence private sector investments in Canada? Maybe Anna, do you want to start with that one, and then we'll turn to Will?
Yeah, and I've got some maybe specific examples that I can share too. I think obviously we know that policy drives investment, so understanding which policies exist in which jurisdictions to drive investment in a given technology or sector is really important. And one example is that, we had folks approach us from the UK who are looking to invest in electric vehicle charging infrastructure across Canada and wanted to understand, where there were the largest incentives, where there were the strongest policies, both for zero emission vehicles, but also for the charging infrastructure to support them. So that's one example where, we could look directly at the database and say, BC has X, Quebec has Y, here's what's happening at the federal level. And that was a really useful resource for that conversation. And I think there's, countless ways in which the database can serve other sectors and other investors.
Yeah, that's a great example, Anna. And I think this database can provide a useful resource for the private sector as well to see both what types of regulations and incentives are available in different jurisdictions, as well as to provide a clear picture for where we see the economy going. A lot of these policies are developed in a way to encourage the technologies and options that reduce emissions. And hopefully by signaling these incentives, it will encourage investment where the private sector might see opportunity going forward and the expectation built by this policy portfolio.
Great. Thanks, Will. I think the next question is a little bit more blue sky in terms of, this is a resource for both, or for the private sector, for governments, for the nonprofit sector, and it's also a resource for academics. So with that in mind, what do you think are some pressing and really interesting research questions using the database?
Yeah, certainly. So I think this can open up a range of research questions and opportunities that we can provide additional detail in Canada. Something I'm really interested in is better understanding these policy mixes and the interactions between policies. Historically, a lot of research is focused on individual policies and trying to isolate their effect from everything else that's happening. We've seen some really interesting research emerge. Just a few weeks ago, there was some research published by a number of co-authors, including Dr. Felix Krutzig at the University of Victoria, that kind of inverts this question and looks at, okay, where have large changes in emissions reductions occurred and what are the policies or policy mixes associated with that? With this comprehensive picture of which policies are in place, this can open up additional questions for how these policies interact and where we see emissions reductions occurring in practice. And I think that's going to be a really important element going forward. Additionally, simply comparing the stringency of policy focused on different sectors and looking at other types of economic impacts or social indicators can also provide useful guidance on how the energy transition is playing out in practice.
Thanks, Will. Anna, any blue sky thoughts?
No, I totally agree with Will. I think the two big questions are, what policies are having the biggest impact and understanding which ones exist and, how they work is really important. And then the interactions piece, I think, is critical. I think, Will's been doing a lot of work in this space, but I still think it's a new area for a lot of folks, especially in some, government departments, and really trying to socialize this idea that interactions can be helpful, but they can also create challenges and can actually reduce the effectiveness of climate policy risks. It's something that we're really focused on. So I think that's really a priority area for research with this database.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about, I think, more knowledge mobilization around the database and those who might use it. Do you see the database being used by journalists to communicate around the policy environment to the public and sort of that sort of critical examination? The question mentions that some climate policies in some jurisdictions might be I guess, have the label of climate policies, but not actually reduce emissions, and whether or not the database can contribute to more critical examination of the policy mix.
Yeah, certainly. I think this database is intended to be an open resource. And I think part of the one of the exciting aspects of that is that to see how people use it and to see how it can be useful to inform. Certainly, journalists would be a great audience to use this database to look at what's available, as well as we continue to build upon some of these measures for policy effectiveness and stringency to be able to compare whether these are sincere efforts going forth across jurisdictions at reducing emissions, to be able to provide these kinds of comparable indicators to see what's going on. I think where we are in Canada, we need to have a very transparent and clear conversation about how we're going to achieve our emissions reduction goals. And this database can be a really useful resource for grounding that discussion, looking at what has been implemented and how is this going to achieve our targets.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add too that we know that journalists are working under crazy tight timelines and often need quick answers around, what policies exist in a given area. So if, a new methane regulation is coming out and they want to understand what governments are doing to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector, they can go to the database and they can search methane and they can get a comprehensive list of all the different actions that have been announced or introduced. So I think that's a really great resource to, direct folks here as a really quick, easy way to get the information that can be really hard to find by kind of skimming the internet for days and days. So the great folks behind C2P2 have done a lot of that legwork.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, I'm going to combine two questions as sort of like in the like thinking long term for this project, and that like right now it's a 3-year initiative. Thinking long term, what are we hoping to achieve, and then what impact do we think the database could have in like in the very ambitious sense?
I think this can both inform and keep a record for the energy transition. I think some of the things we're seeing in Canada, some of the things we've done, it's really about learning from other jurisdictions. And we've seen that as policies are piloted and demonstrated in different jurisdictions, it allows those policies to be adopted elsewhere. We've seen kind of like a stamp, similar policies being implemented in other jurisdictions across Canada and across the US. And by keeping a really clear record of what these policies are, how they're designed, and how effective they've been, we have the opportunity to really export Canadian policy ingenuity around the world, recognizing that emissions are occurring everywhere and we need a global effort to reduce emissions. By acting early and demonstrating what types of policy can be effective, we have a real opportunity to kind of export that expertise, which I think is really important and perhaps a bold ambition for this project.
Thanks, Will. Anna?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Jen, too, because you're the mastermind behind C2P2. But I think we've seen this already, that this database is jump-starting some really interesting and important research on climate policy in Canada. And the dream is that this is the go-to resource for researchers, academics, to use the database to then build on it and do really important research across Canada. So that's, I think, one dream, and I think we're already seeing it in practice, which is great.
Yeah, I guess like my dream for this is for people to have just a better understanding of the landscape of climate policy. Starting this project, I'm not really sure I had a sense of the true number of emissions mitigation policies, or even like with a broader view, the number of climate change policies, like bringing in adaptation or other sorts of policies that are not directly climate policies, but might have emissions co-benefits. And so I think it's better understanding and perhaps better policy integration is what I would hope for. And that is a nice segue to our next question. Is like there's a comment about like, is 327 a lot? Is that a large number of policies? Do we have a sense of how we compare to other countries internationally? Can we use this database to compare to other countries? Will, maybe you can start.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, this ties into the idea that not all policies are created equal. Like in principle, we could achieve emissions reduction targets with one broad, stringent, very effective policy. In practice, there's many other considerations involved in that and many other types of policy objectives that we might want to achieve during the energy transition. So to say, are there enough or too much? I wouldn't be hesitant to come down on either side of that. But I think recognizing that some policies, like a broad-based carbon price, can drive widespread emissions reduction, and more narrowly targeted, for example, electrifying a government vehicle fleet, might have a relatively small impact, depending on the size of the government fleet. And so it's really important to consider what types of policies are needed, both to drive these emissions reductions, drive the technology outcomes that we care about, ensure an equitable and fair distribution, and ensure this is possible politically, that this can be implemented, that it can be effective, and that it can be long-lived.
Thanks. And I guess as an addendum, we like as part of developing this database, we've discovered that the majority of policies are abatement support rather than mandatory policies. And I think one of the open questions is that the right mix? And are these policies truly additional? And the count is not indicative of effectiveness. And so Will, you've done some work on trying to assess interactions. Maybe you can talk about the complexity of actually assessing interactions a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. Capturing the additionality of some of these policies is really challenging. And just to build on Jen's point, with a lot of these abatement support policies, these are often designed to encourage the adoption of new low carbon technologies. As a consumer, you might think of these as an EV rebate if you're going to purchase an electric vehicle or a heat pump. These often occur for producers or businesses to improve the energy efficiency of their production processes or reduce their emissions intensity. Now, these policies are only having an impact if those investments or purchases were not going to be made already. And in some cases, you need the policy sticks or these mandatory policies to actually drive that type of behavior change. And so really capturing kind of what is additional and how those policies interact is really challenging. Particularly when we look at the combination of mandatory policies, say requiring a reduction in the emissions intensity of the transportation fuel supply. Now, when you also have an incentive to adopt EVs, that contributes to the reduction of the emissions intensity of the transportation fuel supply. And so attributing those emissions reductions between these policies can get really challenging and can be really hard to capture. Was this abatement and support policy, or this carrot, necessary to achieving the emissions reduction? Did it provide more equitable outcomes? Did it make it less costly or more costly to achieve those emissions reductions? These are the types of questions we're interested in getting at that make it really hard to capture kind of the necessary number of policies and how they might interact with each other.
Great, thanks, Will. Anna, I think you alluded to this in your opening remarks, but I'd like to expand on sort of how governments are reacting to the policy tracker, and if you've had any, like, I guess, hopefully positive feedback from them, and then I'll turn to Will for any additional comments on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, when we initially decided to do this work about 2 years ago, we met with governments to talk about it and, see if they were amenable to us doing this work, if there's any pushback. And, we got a pretty good reception. I think, they recognize that there's a need for this work. We're seeing governments across Canada increasingly putting these lists in the back of their, emissions reduction plans, or trying to put them on websites. We don't have that kind of transparency across all orders of government, and also a centralized list of what all governments are doing. I think the latest ERP progress report from the federal government is kind of the closest that we're getting to that. So yeah, I'd say that, thinking back to those conversations, there was definitely, lots of positive support for us doing this work, and general receptivity.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. I think it's been really heartening to see the enthusiasm we've received from governments across Canada. When we reached out to jurisdictions to ask for their feedback and to talk about the database and to provide some of this information, that was greeted largely with enthusiasm. We had some great conversations and a real genuine interest to understand what other jurisdictions are doing and what we can learn from these different jurisdictions in Canada. In terms of having this database hosted outside of government, I think that provides a little bit of security, as well as a degree of objectivity in terms of evaluating these policies, especially as we continue to build out metrics for the stringency and coverage of these policies. My concern, candidly, would be that if a government came in that was not interested or not prioritizing climate policy, then this database would no longer be maintained. And I think it's really important that we have a temporal record of what climate policies have been, how these mixes have evolved through time, to be able to understand the policy landscape and evaluate the effectiveness of our policy portfolios.
Great. Thank you so much. I think I'll give a last call for questions from the audience. We have about 12 minutes left. But while I wait for those, any remaining audience questions to come in, I'll ask one of my own, in that the database is a great resource, but it's not, it's not necessarily comprehensive in terms of where it doesn't have the entire suite of what we could call Canadian climate policies. And maybe Anna and Will, you can comment on the pros and cons of our initial decision to focus on mitigation policies.
Yeah, maybe I can start and then pass to Will as kind of us kicking off with the climate policy tracker and then updating it with the policy inventory. But, I think one point is that when we kind of decided to put up this interim database ahead of the C2P2 database, our mandate at 440 is on the mitigation side, and it's on tracking emissions reductions and tracking progress to Canada's emissions reduction targets. So that was very it fit well within our existing mandate. And I think, it's important to be tracking policies at every level of government. We know that especially municipalities are doing a ton of great work on climate action. There's, a need to track adaptation policy, but the scope of that work gets really complex and really difficult. And I think there are trade-offs of having that kind of comprehensive look at all climate policy, as however you define it across the country, but then trade-offs with stewardship and making sure that this remains a very kind of useful, relevant, timely database. And I think that continues to be the main trade-off in my mind.
Yeah, Anna highlights the tension very well. There was a strong desire and initial inclination to capture everything that might be important, but this became very hard in practice when we started breaking it down and looking at the universe of policies there. And really, any policy that affects economic activity, which is most of them, will have an effect on emissions. So starting from a definition of how does a policy affect emissions generally, just gave us way too broad a scope that it would be years before we ever got this out and in front of people and useful. So balancing this tension of providing what's kind of direct and concrete and intended to drive emissions reduction. And that's why we focused on using government stated objectives. The starting point was taking policymakers at their word that the policies intended to reduce emissions are their climate change mitigation policies. It's important to recognize that that does not capture all of them. Other policies like gasoline excise taxes, which are implemented for other policy goals, also have an impact on emissions and can be important. And conversely, there are many policies in place that might increase emissions or are actively being used to kind of reduce the effectiveness of certain policies, certain policy regimes. And it's important to account for that as well. And additionally, as we go through the energy transition, it'll be important to recognize other types of policies, climate change adaptation policies, just transition policies to make sure workers and households and families aren't left behind in this process. And we're interested in kind of exploring and building out those components as well. But this was very concentrated to try to kind of keep it manageable and tractable and get it out there so it can be useful for people.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Will and Anna, and thank you all for attending. Really appreciated the thoughtful discussion, and we hope to get your feedback on the database in terms of how it's useful to you. Please use it. Please give us comments, and we are actively updating and expanding the database. And so watch the School of Public Policy and the 440 Megatonnes website for updates. And with that, I will draw us to a conclusion. And thank you again. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.